Sarah had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right with David's regular poker gatherings. She'd noticed his relieved sighs when she'd retire for the night, but tonight was different. He invited her, a grin stretching across his face that felt too wide, his eyes too bright. Sarah hesitated, a knot tightening in her stomach. She pictured a smoky room, filled with the scent of cheap whiskey and the boisterous laughter of men she didn't know. She could practically hear the clinking of glasses, the shuffling of cards, and the speculative glances they'd cast her way. Despite her unease, David's insistence on a harmless night of fun, a chance for them to bond, managed to sway her. A spark of curiosity, a tiny seed of doubt, whispered that this was her opportunity to see the man her husband became in her absence. She agreed, justifying it as just a single night. After all, what could possibly go wrong? She dressed in a manner she deemed modest, stepping into a living room where David and his companions were already assembled. The room fell silent as they all fixed their gazes upon her, hungry, curious, predatory. A blush crept up her neck as she wished she could vanish into thin air. But David, sensing her discomfort, offered a reassuring smile, taking her hand and guiding her to a seat. "Relax, darling, it's just a game," he murmured, his voice warm and soothing. Sarah forced a smile, but the knot in her stomach tightened. Their stares lingered for far too long, their smirks too knowing. She felt like an outsider, a trespasser. David's presence, however, kept her anchored. David handed her a potent drink. The amber liquid burned as she swallowed, making her wince. The men chuckled, exchanging knowing glances that sent shivers down her spine. She hoped the alcohol would calm her nerves, but it only offered a sliver of relief as the evening progressed. The poker game blurred into a whirlwind of laughter, cards, and increasingly bold comments. Their words, once casual, took on a darker, more suggestive tone. Compliments about her dress, her smile, her figure, each more brazen than the last. Sarah tried to laugh it off, to ignore their hands brushing against her as they reached for cards or drinks. But the touches became more frequent, more intentional. She felt the intensity of their stares, the way they stripped her with their eyes, and most disturbingly, David didn't seem to mind. He laughed along, his arm draped casually over the back of her chair, as if she were a prize they were all vying for. It was Tom, one of David's closest friends, who shattered the illusion of propriety. "Let's crank up the stakes," he suggested, a wicked grin spreading across his face. The room fell silent. Sarah's heart pounded as she glanced at David, hoping he would quash the idea. Instead, he offered a slow, calculating smile that sent a jolt of fear through her. "What did you have in mind?" he inquired, his tone far too calm, far too controlled. Tom's eyes darted to Sarah, then back to David. "How about the loser owes the winner a favor, something personal?" The men chuckled, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Sarah's throat went dry. She forced a laugh, but their leering smiles confirmed that they were deadly serious. Her stomach churned, and she reached for her drink, desperately attempting to steady her nerves. "Come on, Sarah, it's all in good fun," David murmured, his hand squeezing hers beneath the table. His touch was firm, almost possessive. When she looked into his eyes, she saw a glint that made her blood run cold. He wasn't asking. He was declaring that the game was no longer about cards or money. It was about her. The alcohol dulled her senses, clouded her judgment. Before she could devise a way out, the game resumed. The first loss was intentional. She could see it in David's face. He tossed his cards onto the table with a dramatic sigh, feigning disappointment as Tom leaned across the table. "Well, David, I guess that means I win," Tom declared, his eyes lingering on Sarah. "And I think I know just the favor I'd like." Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as Tom stood, circling the table to take a position behind her. His hand slid onto her shoulder, his fingers brushing her neck. She froze, her heart hammering. but David's encouraging nod prevented her from pulling away. The men watched with eager anticipation as Tom leaned down, his lips hovering near her ear. "A kiss," he whispered, his voice low and husky with desire. Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to get up and flee, but the weight of their gazes held her captive, and David's silent approval crushed any hope of escape. She slowly turned her head, her eyes meeting Tom's. He was far too close, his breath warm against her skin. The kiss was fleeting, but the men's cheers and jeers made her feel exposed, on display for their entertainment. Tom pulled away, his grin triumphant, and returned to his seat. Everything had changed. The stakes had been elevated, and Sarah could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the men regarded her now. Not as David's wife, but as a prize to be won. Emboldened by the kiss, the men pushed further. Each round of poker became more intense, more treacherous. The favors they demanded grew bolder, more intimate. With each loss, Sarah felt herself being drawn deeper into a game she never wanted to play. Her pulse quickened as she realized where the night was headed, but the alcohol and the unrelenting pressure from the men left her powerless to resist. She attempted to protest, to remind them that she was David's wife, that this was supposed to be a light-hearted evening, but the men closed in around her, their excitement palpable. David's placid demeanor did nothing to reassure her. In fact, it only deepened her sense of betrayal. How could he sit there and watch as his friends pushed her further and further without uttering a word? Her heart raced, panic settling in as the men's demands became impossible to ignore. The air grew heavy with tension, every breath a struggle. The room seemed to shrink around her, and the once friendly faces of David's friends now looked like predators circling their prey. Then came the breaking point. The men encircled her, their hands on her, their voices a cacophony of lust and demand. Her resistance crumbled under their relentless pressure, her mind clouded by the alcohol and the betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. The night spiraled out of control, transforming from a harmless game into something far darker and more perilous. Sarah was caught in the middle, defenseless, exposed, and utterly alone. As the night wore on, she realized with a sinking heart that there was no escape. This was no longer a poker night. It was a twisted game of power, lust, and degradation, and she was the unwilling pawn trapped in the middle. She was ensnared, and the only way out was to endure. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she sat, frozen, surrounded by the men who had stripped her of everything except the dress she now regretted wearing. The room was hot, stifling with a mixture of alcohol and sweat. Each time David lost another hand, it was as though a piece of her was being chipped away, leaving her vulnerable and raw. The rules of the night had changed, and the men were no longer just playing poker. They were playing with her. With each loss, they demanded more, their voices growing louder, more insistent. Sarah felt herself slipping, her will crumbling under the relentless pressure. The first time Tom had taken her, it had been with a roughness that left her trembling, but the others were no gentler. Each act was more degrading than the last, and each time she complied, she felt another part of herself die. She was no longer Sarah, she was just a body, an object for their pleasure. The men took turns, their hands rough and demanding, their laughter echoing in her ears. Her cries for help, for mercy, were met with cold indifference. David sat back, watching with a sickening satisfaction, his eyes gleaming in the dim light as if he were savoring every moment of her humiliation. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This is what he had wanted all along. Sarah's mind reeled, unable to comprehend the depth of David's treachery. The man who had once been her protector, her partner, had orchestrated her downfall with a calculated cruelty that left her breathless. She had been naive, trusting, and now she was paying the price for that trust. The poker night had never been about bonding or fun. It had been a carefully constructed trap, and she had walked right into it. Despite the disgust that churned in her stomach, Sarah felt a strange thrill coursing through her veins. The men's attention, their power over her. It was intoxicating in a way she couldn't understand. The lines between pleasure and pain blurred, and she hated herself for the way her body responded to their touch. Each caress, each bite, sent shivers down her spine, confusing her emotions and making her question everything she thought she knew about herself. The men grew bolder, their actions more forceful as the night wore on. They began to compete for her attention, each one trying to outdo the other and degrade her. Sarah felt like a prize they were all fighting to claim, her autonomy stripped away with every passing second. She was no longer a person. She was a possession, something to be used and discarded at their whim. Finally, the pressure became too much. The weight of their lust, their aggression, shattered something within her. Sarah collapsed in a heap on the floor, her body racked with sobs. The men didn't stop. They barely even noticed. They continued their assault, their voices blending into a cacophony of noise that drowned out her cries. It was David who finally intervened, but not to save her. He knelt beside her, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered words that cut deeper than any blade. "This is what you deserve, Sarah. You brought this on yourself." His voice was cold, devoid of any affection or remorse. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by a monster who took pleasure in her suffering. The betrayal was complete. Any hope she had clung to, any belief that David might still care for her, was shattered. The men took control of the night, dictating her every move, using her as they pleased. She was passed around like a toy, her cries ignored, her pain dismissed. The power dynamics were clear. She was theirs, and there was nothing she could do about it. Sarah's desperation intensified with each passing minute. She searched for a way out, for an escape from the nightmare she found herself in. But every exit was blocked, every attempt to flee met with laughter and forceful hands that dragged her back into the center of their twisted game. She was trapped, surrounded by men who saw her as nothing more than a tool for their pleasure. The culmination of the night arrived when David, her husband, the man she had trusted above all others, joined in. His touch was no different from the others, cold, calculated, and devoid of any love. Sarah's heart shattered as he treated her like a stranger, like an object to be used and discarded. The man she once knew, once loved, was gone, replaced by a monster who reveled in her humiliation. As the night dragged on, Sarah's mind began to unravel. She realized that this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a complete annihilation of everything she had believed in. Her marriage, her love, her trust in David. It had all been destroyed in a single night. She understood, with a painful clarity, that things would never be the same again. The bond between them had been severed, and there was no going back. When the men finally relented, leaving her bruised and broken on the floor, the room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling from the ordeal. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. She was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, but David offered no solace. He stood over her, a cold, satisfied smile on his lips, as if he had achieved exactly what he had set out to do. And in that moment, Sarah knew that she was truly alone. Sarah awoke the next morning, her body aching with a dull, relentless pain that seeped into her bones. The room was filled with the early light of dawn, but it did nothing to warm the cold void that had settled inside her. She pulled the covers up around her, as if they could shield her from the memories that assaulted her the moment her eyes opened. The night before felt like a nightmare, too surreal to be true, but the bruises on her skin told a different story. She tried to shake off the haze that clouded her mind, but the events of the poker night replayed themselves in agonizing detail. She could still feel their hands on her, the way they had touched her, as if she belonged to them, as if she were nothing more than a toy for their amusement. Guilt and shame wrapped themselves around her heart, squeezing until it hurt to breathe. She felt tainted, dirty, and yet, despite the revulsion that churned in her stomach, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The worst part was David. How could he have done this to her? How could he have sat there watching as his friends used her without lifting a finger to stop them? And how could she have let it happen? But these questions twisted into something darker, something she didn't want to acknowledge. Beneath the disgust, beneath the horror, there was something else. A craving, a twisted desire that she couldn't push away. As she lay there, unable to face David, she was consumed by the guilt of her own body's betrayal. She hated herself for the way she had responded, the way her skin had burned under their touch despite her mind's desperate pleas to stop. The memories came in flashes, sharp and painful, each one more vivid than the last. She tried to block them out, but they persisted, teasing her with the forbidden pleasure she had felt, even as her heart screamed in protest. Days passed, and the memories didn't fade. If anything, they grew stronger, more insistent. Sarah found herself drifting back to that night, her mind replaying the sensations with a clarity that left her breathless. She would catch herself shivering, her body reacting involuntarily to the memory of their hands on her skin. The thrill of being desired, of being the center of their dark, twisted game, lingered in the back of her mind like a forbidden secret. She tried to ignore it, to focus on anything else. But the desire nudged at her, growing stronger with each passing day. It terrified her, this pull towards something she knew was wrong, something that had nearly destroyed her. But she couldn't deny the thrill it gave her, the way it made her heart race and her pulse quicken. She was trapped in a web of conflicting emotions, hating herself for wanting more, for craving the very thing that had shattered her. David noticed, of course he did. He had always been adept at reading her, at knowing what she was thinking before she even uttered a word. And now he saw the struggle within her, the way she avoided his gaze, the way her hands trembled when he came near. He saw the desire she was too ashamed to admit, and he used it against her. He didn't push her, not initially. Instead, he was patient, waiting until she was on the verge of collapse before making his move. He began to drop hints, subtle suggestions that they could have another poker night, that it could be just as exhilarating as the last. He framed it as a way to reclaim control, to turn the tables on the men who had humiliated her. His words were like poison, seeping into her mind, wearing down her resistance until she couldn't tell where her thoughts ended and his manipulation began. Sarah wanted to refuse, to put an end to the madness before it consumed her entirely. But David's words played on her fears, on her desires, until she found herself nodding, agreeing to another night with the same men who had broken her. She told herself it would be different this time, that she would just observe, that she wouldn't let them touch her again. But deep down, she knew she was deceiving herself. The second poker night began much like the first. Sarah dressed meticulously, her hands shaking as she slipped into a dress that clung to her in all the right places. The men arrived, their eyes lighting up when they saw her, and Sarah felt the familiar knot of fear and excitement twist in her stomach. She told herself she could manage it, that she was in control this time. But as the night wore on, as the drinks flowed and the men's flirtations grew bolder, she felt herself being pulled back into the game. David encouraged her, his words a constant presence in her ear, urging her to relax, to enjoy herself. And despite her best efforts, Sarah found herself responding. The stakes were raised, the game became more intense, and she was drawn in, unable to resist the pull of the dark, forbidden world they had created. It didn't take long for the cycle of addiction to begin. Each poker night became a test of her willpower, a challenge to see how far she could go, how much she could take. The men pushed her boundaries further with each round, their demands growing more outrageous, more degrading. And Sarah, despite the shame and self-loathing that followed, found herself craving the thrill, the attention, the feeling of being desired by so many. Outside of the poker nights, her relationship with David twisted into something unrecognizable. He used her addiction against her, controlling her with a subtlety that left her feeling trapped, powerless. By day, she played the role of the respectable wife, the perfect picture of domesticity, but by night she was something else entirely, a willing participant in David's games, a slave to the desires that consumed her. It wasn't long before the men began seeking her out in private. They wanted their own piece of her, their own taste of the woman who had become their plaything. Sarah was pulled into clandestine affairs, her guilt piling up with each illicit encounter. But the danger, the taboo of it all, only fueled her addiction. She couldn't stop herself, even as it ravaged her from the inside. The conflict within her grew unbearable. Sarah hated what she had become, hated the way she craved the very things that were tearing her apart, but the addiction was too strong, the pull too powerful. She was caught in a downward spiral, unable to escape, unable to stop herself from seeking out the next high, the next poker night. Then came the breaking point. Sarah, desperate for the thrill, the degradation, the attention, willingly initiated the next poker night. She craved it with a need that terrified her, a need that drove her to do things she never would have imagined. The men were eager, ready to take advantage of her desperation, and David watched with a cold satisfaction as she surrendered herself completely to the darkness. The night spiraled into a dark orgy of lust and power, with Sarah at the center, the object of their twisted desires. She was passed from man to man, each one taking what he wanted, leaving her more broken, more hollow with each touch. The thrill was gone, replaced by a numbness that seeped into her soul, leaving her empty and devoid of anything but the addiction that consumed her. When it was over, when the men had had their fill and Sarah was left alone, she realized there was nothing left of the woman she had once been. The addiction had taken everything, leaving her shattered and broken, with nothing but the memory of what she had lost. Sarah thought she had hit rock bottom, but as she was about to learn, there was always another level to fall. The poker nights had become a ritual she dreaded and craved in equal measure, each one stripping away another layer of her soul until there was nothing left but the addiction that consumed her. But what she didn't realize was that the walls around her were closing in, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. It started with whispers. Sarah noticed them at work, the way her colleagues would glance at her when they thought she wasn't looking, their conversations falling silent as she entered the room. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the tension was palpable. The poker nights had been their secret, a dark world separate from her day-to-day life. But now it seemed that world was bleeding into her reality, staining everything it touched. The rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by the men who couldn't keep their mouths shut. They bragged about their conquests, about the things they had done to her, turning her into the subject of lewd jokes and whispers. The once respectable image she had maintained at work began to crumble, and with it, her sense of control. Sarah felt her world closing in, the walls of her life pressing down on her, suffocating her. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. It was a Thursday afternoon, the office quiet except for the low hum of computers and the occasional ring of a phone. Sarah was at her desk, trying to focus on her work, when one of her male co-workers approached. He leaned over her, too close for comfort, his breath reeking of stale coffee and something sour. "So, Sarah," he began, his voice laced with mockery, "heard you've been getting pretty wild at those poker nights." Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice steady, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "Oh, come on," he sneered, his eyes raking over her with a disgusting leer. "We've all heard the stories. Didn't think you had it in you." Sarah's face burned with shame, but she couldn't let him see how much his words affected her. "You need to stop spreading lies," she said, her voice firmer this time. "It's none of your business." But the damage was already done. The shame and fear of exposure consumed her, making it impossible to focus on her job. Every glance, every whisper, every conversation became a reminder of how far she had fallen. She felt like she was walking on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from plummeting into the abyss. At home, things were no better. David had grown cold, distant, treating her with a casual indifference that cut deeper than any physical blow. He no longer saw her as his wife, but as a possession, a plaything to be used and discarded. Sarah noticed the change in him, the way he barely looked at her anymore, the way his touch had lost all warmth. She began to wonder if he had ever loved her, or if she had always been just a pawn in his twisted games. The men from the poker nights became bolder, their demands more insistent. They started showing up unannounced, expecting her to be available at their whim. Sarah was pushed to the brink, unable to refuse them, her addiction chaining her to the degrading cycle she had created. Each visit left her feeling more hollow, more broken, but she couldn't find the strength to say no. Desperate to escape, Sarah tried to confront David. She begged him to stop the poker nights, to give her a chance to rebuild their relationship, to salvage what little remained of her dignity. But David dismissed her pleas with a cold laugh, reminding her that she was the one who kept coming back for more. His words were like knives, cutting through her already fragile sense of self. Sarah realized then that there was no escape, no way out of the prison she had built for herself. The men planned a final poker night, more elaborate and depraved than any before. This time, they invited more people, turning Sarah into a spectacle for a larger audience. She was paraded in front of strangers, her dignity completely stripped away as she was passed around. The ultimate humiliation. The men's laughter echoed in her ears, their hands rough and demanding. But Sarah felt nothing. She was numb, detached, watching the events unfold as if they were happening to someone else. Then, during the final poker night, one of the men crossed a line, doing something so vile, so degrading, that it shattered any remaining trust Sarah had in David and the others. The event was so traumatic that it left her mentally and emotionally scarred. Her addiction finally turned into disgust and self-loathing. She realized then that there was nothing left of the woman she had once been, nothing but a shell, a broken, hollow shell. The morning after, Sarah was left alone in a house that felt alien to her. The silence was deafening, and she was consumed by the realization of what she had become. She was a shell of the person she once was, her self-worth completely eroded by the nights of degradation and submission. The walls of her life, once so strong, had crumbled into dust, leaving her with nothing but the ruins of her shattered existence. In her darkest moment, Sarah discovered the final betrayal. David had been having an affair with another woman, someone who had never been part of the poker nights, someone who was treated with the love and respect that Sarah had been denied. The discovery broke her further, revealing that she had never been enough for David, not even as a pawn in his games. She realized then that she had lost everything, her dignity, her marriage, and her self-respect. Sarah's world collapsed around her as the weight of it all came crashing down. She spiraled into a deep depression, unable to see any way out. The walls of her life, the life she had once known, closed in on her, suffocating her, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. The darkness that had consumed Sarah's life seemed to have no end, spiraling further and further into an abyss from which she feared she would never escape. The poker nights were behind her, but the scars they left, both seen and unseen, were ever present, lingering like a shadow over every moment of her existence. Just when she thought she had reached the nadir, a new terror emerged, pulling her deeper into the nightmare that had become her life. It began with a message, a simple, unassuming note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the contents were unmistakable. One of the men from the poker nights had decided he wasn't finished with her. He demanded more private meetings, his own secret sessions where he could have her all to himself. If she refused, he threatened to expose everything: the poker nights, the degradation, the depths to which she had sunk. Sarah was trapped, her fear of exposure clashing with the crushing weight of her own guilt. The cycle of degradation that she had hoped was over had only just begun. Sarah's days became a blur of fear and submission. She met the man in secret, obeying his every command, his every whim, all while the threat of exposure loomed over her like a guillotine ready to drop. The guilt gnawed away at her, each encounter leaving her more hollow, more broken than before. She felt herself slipping away, losing a little of herself with each degradation. It wasn't just physical. It seeped into her very soul, poisoning every thought, every emotion. Her friends, sensing something was wrong but unaware of the full extent of her situation, began to distance themselves from her. They didn't understand why she had changed, why the once vibrant and confident woman they knew had become a shadow of her former self. The isolation deepened Sarah's despair, leaving her with no one to turn to, no one who could help her escape the prison she had built for herself. She was utterly alone, surrounded by people who couldn't or wouldn't see the truth. But the man's demands didn't stop at their secret meetings. He grew bolder, more dangerous, pushing Sarah to take greater risks. He wanted more than just private encounters. He wanted her to degrade herself in public, to push the boundaries of what was acceptable, to court danger with every step she took. Each time, Sarah told herself it would be the last, that she couldn't possibly sink any lower, but the addiction pulled her back in, stronger than ever. The thrill of the risk, the danger, the taboo, it was intoxicating, even as it destroyed her from the inside out. It was during one of these public encounters that Sarah met a stranger who recognized her from the rumors. They were in a dimly lit bar, far from her usual haunts, but the man's gaze lingered on her with a mix of disgust and pity. When he finally approached her, his words were cutting, laced with judgment that pierced through the fog of her addiction. "I've heard the stories," he said, his voice low and cold. "You've fallen a long way, haven't you?" Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, the words hitting her harder than she expected. The stranger's gaze was unrelenting, forcing her to confront the reality of how far she had fallen. The encounter ignited a flicker of shame within her, a small, struggling spark that began to combat the overwhelming darkness of her addiction. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah saw herself as she truly was, a woman trapped in a cycle of degradation, unable to escape the choices she had made. The revelation came when she stumbled upon a piece of evidence she hadn't been meant to see. An email left open on David's computer. It was a correspondence between him and the man who had been blackmailing her. The contents were chilling in their cold, calculated cruelty. David had been orchestrating everything from the beginning, manipulating her addiction against her, using her as a pawn in his twisted game. The blackmail, the escalating demands, the public humiliation, it had all been part of his plan, a plan designed to break her completely. Sarah felt the floor fall out from under her as she realized the depth of David's betrayal. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had engineered her downfall, pushing her further and further into the abyss until there was nothing left of the woman she had once been. The revelation left her reeling, her trust completely shattered. The man she had once loved, once trusted, had been the architect of her destruction. But with the revelation came a spark of something else: anger, a fierce, burning anger that began to cut through the despair that had gripped her for so long. Sarah realized she couldn't continue living under David's control, couldn't continue being a puppet in his twisted games. She gathered what little strength she had left, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of purpose. She began planning her escape, knowing the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but determined to reclaim what little was left of her dignity. The confrontation was inevitable. Sarah waited until the moment was right, until she had everything she needed to confront David and make her stand. When the time came, she stood before him, her voice steady and unwavering as she revealed that she knew about his manipulation, about the way he had used her addiction against her. She demanded a divorce, threatening to expose everything if he didn't comply. David, caught off guard by her sudden strength, tried to regain control, but Sarah's resolve was stronger than he had anticipated. But David wasn't done playing his games. In a twisted turn of events, he suggested one final poker night, this time with Sarah in control. He offered her a chance to reclaim her dignity by turning the tables on the men who had degraded her, to use them as they had used her. Sarah agreed, but with her own plan in mind, a plan that would ensure she was the one who walked away with the final victory. The final poker night was a night unlike any other. Sarah took control, manipulating the men and David just as they had manipulated her. She used their own weaknesses against them, humiliating them in the same way they had humiliated her. She played the game with a cold, calculated precision, each move designed to strip them of their power, to turn the tables on those who had once controlled her. The night ended with Sarah walking away, leaving the men stunned and David defeated. She didn't look back, didn't pause to see the aftermath of the destruction she had wrought. She had won, but the victory felt hollow, the scars of her past too deep to ever fully heal. Sarah left David and the life she once knew behind, moving to a new city, determined to rebuild herself from the ground up. The scars of her past remained etched into her soul, but she was free from the chains of her addiction, free from the men who had sought to control her. The story ended with Sarah standing on the threshold of a new life, her future uncertain, but finally in her own hands.